We were hearing from Rachel just a moment ago about those survivors' very real fears of another Grenfell Tower, because there are still buildings covered in the same or similar material to that which in 2017 led to 72 deaths, despite changes to laws and regulations. Becky Johnson is our communities correspondent. Becky, just what on earth is going on?
We all remember the horror of Grenfell and those promises over the years since from politicians that such a disaster won't happen again. And like you say, laws have changed as a result of Grenfell. But we've been around the country speaking to people who are still, 7 years on, living in buildings that have unsafe cladding or other fire risks. According to the latest government data, at least 3,280 buildings are known to still have unsafe cladding. Of course, within each of those buildings, there are dozens, potentially hundreds of people. Only 949 of those buildings have had work started on them. And for the people living inside them, it is a nightmare. And many people have been telling us that it's something that they think and worry about on a daily basis.
And I suppose part of the problem has been, perhaps as a result of some of England's kind of more archaic rules around housing and property, is that it's not immediately clear as to who is responsible for this, ultimately who should be paying for any refit. I mean, you've been speaking to someone who's had to take their building owners to court over this. Tell us about Steph and when she first discovered that there was an issue with the place that she, let's not forget, calls home.
Yeah, so Steph bought her flat in a building in Bristol in complete good faith. She didn't even think about whether it had any fire safety issues. So it was a couple of years after she moved in that surveys were done and it became apparent that there were unsafe, potentially flammable, dangerous materials on the building and in the building where she lives. Now, it's a building that has 54 flats. And in 2023, the Building Safety Act came into force. Now, that places responsibility on building owners to replace defective materials. So Steph and one of her fellow tenants in the building actually became among the first people in the country under that act to take their building owner to court to try to force them to replace the dangerous materials on their building. December of last year, the judge ruled that the building owner should replace the materials and gave them a 6-month deadline to do so. That 6-month deadline expired in June of this year and nothing has been done. And the many efforts made by the people who own flats in that building to contact the owners have been met with no response. And so Steph says she feels trapped because the building owner actually has to sign off on any work that will be done. So they can't get the ball rolling without the building owner being involved, and they have seemingly disappeared.
When you talk to somebody that isn't in this situation, it's actually really difficult to get across the severity of it and how it makes you feel from a mental point of view, from a financial point of view, because they just go, well, surely somebody's going to make sure they do that. Are you sure you've spoken to the right people? And you go, yeah, I've knocked on every door, we have, and they're all just shut and no one's holding account to a freeholder that still collects ground rent, still receives money and income on the building, but won't put right the defects that are there.
And the longer that they remain stumm, the longer that they fail to respond to any of these things, the longer that they don't have to put their hands in their pockets and pay for repairs to this building, which would render it safe. Have you managed to get hold of them?
No, we've been trying to contact them too, and no, we haven't. This is a company that exists. In fact, they've applied for planning permission to extend the building, but they're not responding to any form of contact. It's really quite extraordinary. But this is seemingly what's happening to people living in buildings affected. There are either building owners that are delaying carrying out work that it's their responsibility to do, or seemingly disappearing. And so people who own flats in these buildings are spending thousands of pounds on legal fees trying to track their building owner down, let alone get them to do the work.
So why doesn't she just sell up?
Well, the difficulty is, and this is partly how the existence of the unsafe materials in the building have become known about. When people try to sell, obviously potential buyers will get surveys done. And surveys then show up the existence of these unsafe materials, and that then means that no mortgage lender would lend to them. So you've got this situation where, you know, if like Steph, you own one of these flats, you can't sell to anybody who would need a mortgage to pay for it. And she said, you know, she's 37, she bought this flat a number of years ago as her first step on the housing ladder. She was expecting by now to be, you know, potentially in a house with a garden, moving on with her life, she says. And for now, she just can't see how that can happen.
Everybody I speak to, their life has just kind of stopped because they can't move on to the next chapter of their lives. I should be in a house, I should be, you know, little garden, set of stairs, building that part of my life. And instead I'm emailing councils, I'm phoning up fire departments, I'm, you know, dealing with lenders and, you know, trying to keep the rest of the group updated. You don't use Help to Buy for your forever home. That's not how the scheme is designed. The scheme is designed to get you on the ladder, and within 5 years you move on. And we can't do that.
As you've already outlined, Becky, hundreds of buildings still affected by this unsafe cladding material that is on them. But there are people who are living in properties adjudged by the government to be safe, who find themselves in a parallel situation to Steph, in the sense that they are struggling to get mortgages. They're struggling to be able to say that this place is safe and move on.
This affects buildings across the country. I doubt there's a town or city where there isn't somebody affected by this. It really is everywhere. Jim Illingworth, a 65-year-old man we met, who lives in a flat in Birmingham, and it's a flat that he bought with his wife to downsize as they were retiring. And you know, they thought that they would be very happy living in the centre of Birmingham. And that was until surveys found unsafe cladding on their building. Now, unlike Steph, the owner of their building did undergo quite extensive work to replace the cladding.
The building is only half safe because there is polystyrene as an insulation and everything else. Not enough to be insulation, but there to cause a fire risk. It's a B1 level. The B1, according to the government, is nice and safe. According to the insurers and the mortgage people, it's not safe.
So it's an issue with the flats not being fully separated from each other internally, which could mean that a fire could spread quite rapidly within the building. So the building's insurance is now 3 times what it was. Bear in mind he's a pensioner, so that takes a hit. But also remortgaging or a potential buyer getting a mortgage is going to really struggle. In fact, he said their local estate agent won't take on any of the flats in their building to try to sell them because they just won't sell. I have to say that for a lot of these people, they've been living with these worries for a number of years. And speaking to them, I think a lot of them have been hoping that perhaps a new government might help them or might bring some change. Now, it's still early days for the new government, but none of them have seen anything as yet that gives them reassurance that their situation is going to change anytime soon.
I suppose if there were to be a catalyst for action, it may well come in the form of that report from the Grenfell inquiry, mightn't it?
Yes, and I think people hope that that will bring about some change as well. For a lot of people, though, living in these buildings, and certainly Steph in Bristol said this to us, the best they can say is that a fire hasn't happened in their building. And everyone you speak to says, what is everyone waiting for? Is everyone waiting for another disaster like the Grenfell fire? Like, what are these building owners? What is the government? What are all the people who might have regulatory powers or powers to enforce this change? What are they waiting for before they make all the buildings in this country safe?